Scripture for this morning is Matthew 2, verses 19 to 23. Now when Herod had died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. He rose, and he took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. He went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. I was in the doctor's office last Thursday waiting for an eye injection, and in the second waiting room, lots of people were there, and two of them got into a discussion on politics. And they started to be very excited about that, and two others quickly joined into the conversation as well. Hopefully I didn't shake my head too hard or roll my eyes, but they were starting to make very strong statements on the right and on the left, and making these statements as if they were just self-evidently true, and anybody who had a mind that had any sense in it at all would think the same way I do. And I was thinking how that was mimicking news and social media. And yet I also noticed that both sides, as they were making their points, were characterized by bitterness. You could sum up in every one of their statements by basically saying, the problem in the world is this other side's doing this, and if they just quit doing that, we wouldn't have any problems in the world. The bitterness, though, is never a solution or an answer. Now, to their credit, these people kind of toned down the rhetoric, and one of them, of the two others that had joined in later, one distracted the other with talking about a book that was in her lap, so that got them out of the conversation. And the other two changed the subject and talked about personal ailments or something like that. So it toned everything down, and everything was more civil. So to their credit, they did that. But it made me think that bitterness can tempt all of us, because life is hard. Solutions are offered through that bitterness, but those solutions only magnify the hurt in our lives. They never solve any problems, really. We're reminded at this time of year that the only answer, the only solution, is Jesus himself. And the fruit of his work is not to increase the hurt in the world, but it's to bring a righteousness that's deeper than all hurting. That's what our text is lifting up for us, is the baby Jesus with Joseph and Mary we saw on Christmas Eve, and had to go to the land of Israel because of an unrighteous, paranoid ruler who sought to kill him, because thought that by doing that he could protect his own reign. And only after Herod dies, and we don't know how many years that was, Joseph is directed to bring the child and the mother back to his land. Now, we might suspect that Joseph and Mary, in their own logical thinking, would think, well, I guess we should go and live in Bethlehem, because that's where the Lord had us have the child born, because he's going to be a descendant of David. So he must want us to raise him there in Bethlehem. But they give warning again in another dream not to dwell there. But instead, they were led to the region of Galilee and to a small village called Nazareth. And we're told this was to fulfill a scripture, he will be called a Nazarene. Now, the problem with that last scripture is that there's no exact wording in the Old Testament that says he shall be called a Nazarene. And so people wondered, well, what scripture are they referring to? And most of church history, what they've done is they've taken the root from that Hebrew word for the village. Nazareth is the N and the Z and the R. Their roots had three consonants in them, and they would look in the Hebrew language for other words with that same root. And so what they found is there was the word for branch in Hebrew used the N and the Z and the R. And then they thought, the prophets often spoke of a branch from God's hand. For example, Isaiah 4:2 says, "A glorious branch of the Lord will bring honor to God's people." And a little later in chapter 11, at the start, it says, "From David's lineage, the Spirit of the Lord will be upon the branch that will judge with righteousness and bring in a world where there's no hurting or harming anymore, even in the natural world." Or in our call to worship, Jeremiah 23:5, and it's repeated in chapter 33, "A righteous branch will reign to save God's people. So they'll dwell in safety, and his name will be, the Lord is our righteousness." And then building on that, Zechariah in chapter 3 said, "God's servant, the branch, will remove sin, and he will bring his people eternal peace." So when I see all those verses tied in with this righteous branch, or branch of righteousness for the Lord, it makes me think that even the name of the village that this child is going to be brought up in is helping to describe who he is and what work he's going to do. And of course, that village was named even before Jesus was born in the manger in Bethlehem, so that God was preparing all of these things and directing them so that even the name of the village speaks out as good news. And that's what the gospel is, the good news that Jesus is working to so that eternally we're not going to experience hurt or harm anymore. And the way he does that is because he's going to work through us, so that from the inside out we're going to be changed. So instead of harming others when we're in Jesus' kingdom, we will eternally be loving and joyful and peaceful towards our fellow man. He's making us righteous, in other words. So Jesus is and remains the only true solution for the world's problems. Bitterness proposes its solutions, but that only increases the problems. And in the darkness of those solutions, Jesus is still shining the light of God's love. Let's hear an example from a woman named Wendy Miller. She's telling the story of another mother, Mary, and 3 young girls. She said Mary was part of a typical family until 2 years ago. Mary's husband left with only a note put on the kitchen table. Oh, and well, he also emptied the bank account before he left at the same time. Mary had never worked outside the home before. The only work she could find so that she could be around when the kids were off school was to clean houses 5 days a week. It paid the bills, it fed the girls. They did have to accept hand-me-down clothes from the employer's children, and she had to walk the girls to school, even on the coldest days of the year. 7-year-old Laura, 6-year-old Cindy were dropped off at school. Then 3-year-old Becky accompanied Mary to her jobs, well, along with Charlie. Charlie was Becky's doll. Said he looked so ragged, all of his hair had been loved off of him. Charlie had to be dressed every morning before they would go out to work, and they had to be wrapped in his blanket. It was a scrap of material that Becky had found in a parking lot at a store, and so Mary took it home and washed it and gave it back to her. And it was on a cold December day that after dropping the girls off, Mary and Becky and Charlie arrived at the Littles' house. Becky wasn't expecting all the Christmas decorations. "Ooh, Charlie, look at what Mrs. Little's got." It was a large tree, and it was fully decorated, and there were mounds of presents wrapped underneath it. Mary put Becky in a chair and told her not to touch anything while she was working. "I promise, Mama." Instead, she held Charlie and she pointed out all the different ornaments on the tree to him, and then pointed to the presents and tried to guess what was inside each package. Laura and Cindy, as usual, came by for lunch from school, and they hardly looked at the decorations. It hurt to look at them, because they knew they wouldn't have any of their own. Money wasn't spent on anything. that they could do without. Well, that day replayed itself on Tuesday at the Johnsons, Wednesday at the Harrisons, Thursday at the Krebs, Friday at the Finleys. On Saturday, Becky realized something was missing at their house. Why does everyone have a tree, Mama? Why are there so many presents? Is it somebody's birthday? Why don't we have a tree? Well, Mary put down her mending and she picked Becky up and sat her on her lap. It is someone's birthday. I'll tell you about him. His name is Jesus, and he was born on Christmas Day. And she went on to tell the whole story of Jesus' birth. Becky hugged Charlie close. Oh, the poor baby. Was it very cold in the stable? I wouldn't want to live in a stable, but I would like to see it, though. Mary thought, we can see it. She had the girls put their coats on, and they took a walk a couple blocks down the street to the church. There was an outdoor nativity scene with ceramic figures, a wooden stable full of straw. Becky didn't want to leave. She just kept staring at the baby Jesus. The next week was harder as Christmas preparations were getting into full swing. When Mary would go to the grocery store, there were long lines with carts filled with either the ham dinner or the turkey dinner. And she had just had an economy pack of underwear and socks, which were going to be the girls' presents under the tree, and had one pack of spaghetti that was going to be their Christmas dinner. And so she got to go into the express lane, which hardly anybody was in. And even at school, the two older girls were having to write letters to Santa for presents they weren't going to get. And they had to make popcorn strings for a tree they didn't have at home. It was hearing how Laura and Cindy felt that made Mary feel bitter, as she started to hurt for her girls. And then that bitterness rebounded back to the girls as they mimicked their mother's behavior. It seemed like only Becky was immune to all of this. She would keep rocking Charlie back and forth and telling him again and again about the baby Jesus. She begged her older sisters, please take me down to the church and the nativity scene again. And when they finally would, they would never stay as long as she wanted them to stay. On Christmas morning, Laura and Cindy came into Mary's room to warm up. Merry Christmas, they said. Merry Christmas, girls. I'm afraid there aren't many gifts, but you go wake up your sister and you can open what's there. They came back too quickly. Where is she, Mama? She started to race throughout the house and to look every closet, every corner. She was nowhere. Ran outside. She's not in the yard. She came back inside and said a silent prayer. Dear Lord, please help me find her. I'm sorry for my selfishness. The dinner and the gifts I prayed for are not important. Just give me Becky back. And then when she raised her eyes from prayer, she saw Charlie. Becky's never without Charlie, and saw that he didn't have his blanket on. Charlie always has his blanket on. And then she realized. Stay here, she told the older girls. Mary raced down the street to the church just in time to see Becky climbing into the manger and putting Charlie's blanket on the baby Jesus. And she was saying, you must be cold. I know the snow would be falling on you. This is Charlie's blanket, but we'll give it to you. He has me to keep him warm. And then she looked up and said, oh, hi, Mama. I was afraid he might have thought that we forgot him on his birthday. So Mary picked her up and said, I did forget. I'm sorry. She walked back home, the bitterness in her heart now replaced by the joy of the meaning of Christmas. At home, they sang carols. They put those popcorn strings made at school on the largest houseplant. They made a star of tinfoil and put it on top of the houseplant. And Mary made a birthday cake, and they all sang happy birthday to Jesus. All the while Becky held Charlie to keep him warm. Hardness in life can tempt us to bitterness, and that bitterness will offer us solutions to life's problems. Yet those solutions always bring more harm instead of helping. There's only one solution or answer in life, and that answer is Jesus Christ. He's the branch of righteousness who takes away all sin and harm from us by making our hearts never wanting to harm or hurt anyone ever again. We become righteous people before God because he's God's righteous branch who brings in eternal peace, joy, and love. Jesus is and remains the good news that always shines in the darkness.